Well, I want to welcome you all today. I'm thrilled to see so many people here. My name is Robert Feldman. I'm Dean of the College of Social and Behavioral Science. And this is the 6th annual Cole Lecture in Contemporary Issues. The Cole Lecture was created to engage the UMass Amherst community, alumni, students, faculty, and staff, with the interesting work of faculty whose research has a direct impact on world issues. We're thrilled to host this annual event as part of our offerings in the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, where our motto is Connect to Your World. I'd like to tell you a bit about the Coles, who are sitting right here in front, Robert and Margaret Cole. They are the very generous donors who've made the lecture today possible. You should also know that in addition to supporting this lecture, the Coles have funded a scholarship which goes to a student who's doing research relevant to current social problems, and we'll be talking a little bit about that in a moment. Let me tell you a little bit about the Coles. Wonderful, wonderful people, first of all. Bob Cole graduated from UMass Amherst in 1959 with a degree in psychology, and it was here that he met his wife, Peggy, sitting next to him. In the intervening years, Bob has went on to become a top executive of Blue Cross Blue Shield of Delaware. He was in Argentina, Uruguay, Taiwan, all over the world. Now retired, he's active in a number of civic groups, and Peggy has always been involved with a variety of worthy causes and is currently volunteering her time in an organization that promotes educational opportunities for women around the world. In 2007, the Coles decided to connect back to UMass, and they established the lecture series to highlight the excellent work that our faculty members do. Last year, they decided they wanted to have an even greater impact with their giving, so they asked if they could add a scholarship component to their gift. Because of their interest in research that addresses social problems, real-world problems, they decided that it was important to support an undergraduate student who was working to do just that. So I am very pleased to recognize the winner of this year's Cole Undergraduate Research Award, Kyle Little. Kyle? Kyle's a senior journalism major who's part of Nick McBride's community journalism course. Students in this course are paired with high school students at Commerce High School in Springfield, where they work in reporting teams to produce a bi-weekly newspaper. Kyle's research looks at the transformative power this project has on both the high school and the students involved. In this case, journalism is used as a tool to develop civic understanding and political action while also creating meaningful dialogue across racial, cultural, and class divides. We're thrilled to know that this award not only supports Kyle's work, but it will also help with the overall success of the partnership with Commerce High School. Congratulations, Kyle. I look forward to hearing more about your project as it proceeds.
Always one more.
Thank you. Now I'd like to introduce Janice Irvine, who is the chair of the Department of Sociology, and she's going to introduce today's distinguished speaker.
Well, it's my great pleasure to introduce our beloved former chair for this year's Cole Lecture. As Dean Feldman said, the Cole Lecture is delivered by a faculty member whose current research has a direct impact on world issues. Don, a self-described pudgy white guy, has spent his career studying workplace inequality, especially forms of discrimination based on race and gender. His recent book, Documenting Desegregation, is a groundbreaking analysis of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. It paints a sobering portrait of faltering progress in American workplaces, arguing that racial and gender employment segregation remains high today, and that many firms since the 80s show signs of resegregating. The significance of Don's work has been recognized in funding by the National Science Foundation, the Institute for New Economic Thinking, the Russell Sage Foundation, and many others. Don's long and productive career, which has focused on workplace inequality and labor markets, also includes important research on racial profiling by police. And this work on how bias is produced has led to his key role as a social science expert witness in discrimination lawsuits, which is yet another vehicle for social change. I would be remiss not to mention Don's role in training the next generation of sociologists to deal with world issues. In our department, he's an incredibly generous and rigorous mentor to graduate students, not to mention the occasional hapless faculty member like me who needs help with methodology and survey issues. It's impossible to imagine our department without, I was going to say this pudgy white guy, but I think that's one pudgy too much for this introduction.
Two.
So it's really impossible to imagine life in our department without Don. Don's research really embodies the spirit of the Cole Lecture's focus on world problems, and his talk today on exploring rising income inequality could not be more timely. Occupy Wall Street has faded from memory, and we're on our first day back from a government shutdown and looming default, with a Congress that is unable and unwilling to confront inequality or enact meaningful financial reform. So please join me in welcoming Don Tomaskovic-Devey for this Cole lecture called Talk, How Wall Street is Distorting Main Street.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Janice. Thank you all, oh my goodness, for being here today. It's a good, nice big crowd. You know, I always, when I give lectures like this where I don't have a captive audience, I get up in the morning and I wonder, will anybody show? And so it's very nice to see so many people here, and I did see the audience with 50 of you from my class, which meets at exactly this time. The introduction stressed that I've been doing a lot of work on workplace inequality and on racial and gender inequality in workplaces, but the very first research I did as a graduate student was political economy work about the change in the kind of organizational and political culture in the United States to what we now call neoliberalism. And my first empirical paper was on one of the early bank crises. And so this is a kind of return to your roots research project. All research projects are embedded in social relationships, as are all economies. Ken Howlin is my research assistant and collaborator on this project. He's now at the University of Texas at Austin. Anything I say here that's right, Ken had a really strong role in. There's also a larger intellectual community around me. I want to do a strong shout out to the economics department at UMass Amherst. This is Jerry Epstein and James Crotty and new PhD student Layla Davis on the left. The economists at UMass really saw this financialization problem before it became evident to the rest of the world, and we're really ahead of the game. On the right side is my current RA, Nate Myers. Nate, it's back here. How did I get your picture, you might wonder. And two sociologists at University of Michigan, Greta Krippner and James Davis, who've done really important work on showing the institutional rise of financialization and its cultural consequences. So, okay, you all know this story, or you probably know some version of this story. Housing prices sort of edged up a little bit over a very long time and then exploded in the 2000s. This is a classic case of what we call a bubble. All right? Now, this bubble was not driven by this demand for homes, but it was driven by the demand for mortgage-backed securities. it was in the interest of investment banks to create mortgage-backed securities, and to do that they needed to generate mortgages, and they did. And then the bubble popped. The Lehman Brothers were not bailed out by the Federal Reserve or by the other banks, and the world economy crashed. And that's the story that I would assume that many of you know. It's kind of the core story of the crisis and the past recession. And I'm going to talk a little bit, just a minute or two more about one thing that's important that we learned there from this process here. But then I'm going to go and give you a story that's much more institutional and historical about how we got to this place and why the problems are not just about bubbles, though bubbles are problems. So one of the things is when the market crashes, people discovered that there's such a thing as systemic risk, right? That when Lehman Brothers fails, it doesn't just mean Lehman Brothers fails, but all the other major financial institutions that have a chunk of Lehman Brothers on their books, those assets go to zero. And if you're a highly leveraged bank, that is, you've got maybe $1 of assets for $1 of reserves for every $30 under assets. If you lose a couple of dollars worth of those reserves, you're suddenly insolvent, right? And so the idea of systemic risk is that each different organization doesn't have a risk, but it has also the risk of the organizations it's linked to, right? And this is a big problem if all the organizations are tightly linked together. The problem gets magnified if they're very big organizations, right? And that's part of the story here, that the financial system at this moment in time is populated by a very few very large organizations, and they are all very tightly connected to each other. And we are all tightly connected to them. So if you think about this network as now the white hole in the middle of this network, when you talk about the whole economy as a set of relationships among actors, among firms and households, right? The banking system is now at the core of that economy. It is tightly networked, and even though all of us around the edges are more weakly tied together, there's a certain amount of risk that comes from if the system, a certain amount of risk to the larger system that comes from that tight coupling in the core. In addition, so that's about all I'm going to say about systemic risk. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about how we got here and then the inequality consequences of that. In addition, in any network, in any set of social relationships, some actors are more powerful than others, right? And that power can be a function of size, but it's often a function of the dependency of other actors, other people, other organizations on each other. And so one of the things that we have when an economy is dominated not only by a single sector, but very large firms in a single sector, their power over the rest of the society grows disproportionately. I'd say exponentially, but that's sort of suggests more precision than I have. Okay, so how did we get here? I'm going to talk about the financialization of the US economy, the creation of this kind of dense, important, culturally and economically important core to the economy. And so the first is the story that you already know in your head to some extent, which is there's this increased centrality and structural power of financial firms. There's another story that most people don't know, but once I start telling you it, you'll say, oh yeah, I knew that, which is that a lot of non-financial firms increasingly are behaving like banks. That is, they're pursuing financial rather than production-based strategies for accumulation. At the kind of more our sense of what's right and proper, that is, what should an economy look like, increasingly we think that economies should need to be dominated by these large firms. these large, and that the financial sector is crucial to what an economy is. Now, the point I'm going to make, the next set of points I'm going to make are historical, and it's going to say it always wasn't this way. That is, this is what seems to be natural and take it for granted now. But it's a relatively recent social product, and we can see how it was produced institutionally. And so both this cultural prioritization and political power associated with finance are things that we created as a society, and things that could be uncreated. I'm not going to say so much about that, so you might want to ask at the end. Make me work harder. Okay, so now let's go back to the 1970s. At the end of World War II, there were two advanced industrial societies that had not sustained consistent bombing and physical damage from the war. That was Sweden and the United States. Sweden was really small. So at the end of World War II, the United States comes out as the dominant economic player in the world, and it doesn't have much in the way of competition. There are no alternative industrial economies if you need to buy steel or cars or radios or just about anything. Now, this was good for the economic fortunes of the United States at the time. By the 1970s, that kind of international dominance had run out. Now, it had partly run out because there's now more game in town, more companies and countries in town with companies that can compete with US companies. And other things happened as well. In the United States, we had a rise of union power and consumer power. That is, this long boom period also led to rising incomes at the household level, increased unionization. We began to worry about things like environmental pollution, equal opportunity employment, occupational safety and health. That would have been a real luxury in the 1930s. So we have this kind of global pressure and then internal pressure on the profitabilities of US corporations. At the same time, at the same time, we also had these shocks to the system associated with the rise in oil prices, associated with the Organization of Petroleum States. So now this led to a kind of a real crisis in the boardrooms of American corporations. Their ability to export, to make profits, to figure out what's an investment to make in the next round were totally destabilized. The world became uncertain. That happened at the same, and as this happened, we also have this new economic phenomena, high inflation and low or no economic growth, right? And so it seems like the rules of the game have changed fundamentally. Now, this leads to problems in the manufacturing sector as to kind of what's the next round of investment going to look like. It leads to, especially the inflation, leads to sharp drops in the profitability of banks because the old banking model was to lend to you at fixed interest rates. I don't know if there's anyone in the room. When I was in graduate school in the early 80s, we got a federally subsidized student loan. My wife and I, who's in the middle back there. And the loan was at 5%. And we put it in a CD at 18%, right? So all of the kind of traditional notions of who had power in interest-bearing investments got flipped on its head. And at the same time, though, the United States is still the attractive destination for investment capital. The United States remains the core, the US dollar remains the core currency for transactions in the world. And people put their money when they have leftover money in treasury bonds because they're safe. So one of the things that we have coming out of the 70s is a real crisis about what an economy should look, the U.S. economy should look like. Probably not what it looked like in the past. But at the same time, the United States still is a place that money flows into. And those two things are important as for the roots of this financialization process. Right? So what happens? Well, corporate actors mobilize, as you'd expect. And they define the problem as excessive government regulation, excessive taxes, and a smaller state. They don't just define the problem as globalization, or if they do, what are we going to do about that? Right? That's a hard thing. So we have an attack out of on the state, and especially on regulation, taxes, and the like, coming out of the business sector. Now, during this period, the banks, the finance sector, banks and insurance companies are the core actors. They're the ones who lead the charge. But there are other actors out there. Consumer movements totally wanted to deregulate the banks because if you were a retiree and you had all your money in the local bank and you were getting 5%, which was the maximum amount banks were allowed to pay you back then, you wanted that 18% deal those students were getting right now with their CDs. So there was a kind of a left pressure for deregulation as well. Then we have lots of money going into institutional investors, some from foreign capital, some from like US pension funds, looking for places to put their money because they're not so sure that manufacturing is a good deal anymore. Okay, there are a bunch of ideological shifts that happen along with this. So these are kind of political shifts. Okay? There are ideological shifts as well. First of all, the kind of policy model that was built around traditional Keynesian economics falls apart around stagflation. Keynesian theory is not good at explaining why this was happening. At the same time, in the economics profession, which is where people turn to for answers, the macro-micro synthesis around a free market, competitive neoclassical model has gained hold across the 60s. It's fairly dominant across the 70s, except on this campus. Though there was a good deal of fights even on this campus over this, this shift. And that at the level of ideas, kind of global ideas, becomes part of the framework of how do you solve any problem. And then, so the policy response under uncertainty is we are skeptical of any institutions that are not market-like, and competition is going to be the solution wherever we can do it. There are also much more specific theories about within economics that speak directly to how do we solve financial problems. Some of them are actually institutional. Agency theory tells us that corporations were not really operating in the shareholders' interest. Instead, they were operating in the interest of the CEOs and employees and people like that. It's about too much institutional autonomy in large corporations. We have the efficient market hypothesis, which says you don't really need to regulate the financial system. All of the prices that get set have taken into account all the information that is out there. There's no such thing as a bubble in this theory. And then you have a kind of more technical kinds of things where like the Black-Scholes-Merton formula, which is a way to create derivatives and various types of bets, not only on growth but on decline. And so altogether, we have these ideas not only from economics but also from the private sector, which leads to this kind of policy regimes that we now talk about as neoliberalism, which has an anti-government, anti-institutional, pro-market solution whenever you got a problem. Okay, so what does this have to do with banks? So we have, starting in the late 70s, a series of banking deregulations that are aimed at the Glass-Steagall Act. So the Glass-Steagall Act was in 1933. It was the response to the Great Depression, and it was a set of controls on banks. And first it broke up different types of banking activities into different kinds of organizations, savings and loans, commercial banks, insurance. These all had to be done by different firms. They all had a different set of regulators. Most savings and loan and commercial banking did not cross state lines, keeping banks small. There were caps on interest rates. Savings and loans got to pay you an extra 0.5% relative to commercial banks to encourage you to put your money there. And so this system was a system that was designed to keep the financial system disconnected and small, the opposite of the story I told you at the beginning. So then we have a series of deregulations. The first one actually comes from the Supreme Court, which allows credit, sort of undermines usury laws. That's why your credit card. Anyone here have a credit card that's charging them more than 12% right now? That's all of you. Come on. All of you. 20%? 25%? You don't have to raise your hand for that one. And then there's a series of deregulations that basically step by step take Glass-Steagall apart. Right? The last one, the Financial Services Modernization Act, is sort of the most interesting, mostly because it made it legal for investment banks, commercial banks, and insurance companies to combine their operations, even though they'd already been doing it for 5 years at this point. So this was the Congress catching up with the bank's behavior. So okay, what happens? We also then, over time, we've got these deregulations, but that political process is still playing out, right? And the kinds of theories of that deregulation is the solution to problems, that markets will be efficient and don't need to be looked at, gets reinscribed every time people move back and forth between the large banks and the regulators. The regulators adopt the efficient markets theory, which is associated with this guy, Eugene Fama, who actually got the Nobel Prize this week. It's like a crime. It's like a big crime. So that as the bubble happens, we have regulators saying there's no such thing as bubbles. Right? And so we have a group of people who become important in the architecture of deregulation and then are the important regulators at the time of the crash. Larry Summers is not going to be the next Federal Reserve Chairman. And then we have the kind of two kind of more generic processes that are not inside the regulatory apparatus. Banks become increasingly important sources of funding for congressional and presidential races, regardless of your party. And people begin to think they're the smartest people in the room. Right? And you all know how you can tell who's the smartest person in the room. Right? It's the person who's earning the most money. Right? And what we've done is we've set up a system that ensured that they'd earn the most money, which makes them the smartest people in the room, which allows them to get a lot of, whoops. Excuse me, I lost my microphone. A lot of social power. So what happens? One is we have a rise in money coming into financial instruments. This is really largely being driven by institutional investors in the United States and foreign investors into the United States. So there's a ton of cash pouring in. And we have a concentration in the system. We have fewer banks. Whoops, wrong direction. So right now, the top 3 bank holding companies, that's the blue line, have about 35% of the total banking activity in the US economy. 3 companies. Right? The top 10 are about 55%. Right? So that's another way of thinking about that network diagram early on. Right? That is, almost all of the financial activity in this country is flowing through just 6 organizations. They all own big chunks of each other. You take one out, and it's like that Jenga game. You know that game with all the sticks up here? You pull the bottom thing out, and it collapses. All right. So the other thing that happens is this is an amazingly profitable thing. Right? So right before the crash, the finance sector is getting 50% of all the profits in the United States. Right? So let's think you're going to try to run a small business. You are competing for the surplus in the society with these banks. Right? Now you're doing it partly because you have a credit card machine. Right? And every time that credit card machine sells something, they're taking 1.5 to 2.5% off the top. Right? Or for you, at your house, every time you do a financial transaction, there's a new fee. Right? And you've only got one place to go. Right? Or you could have a credit card where you miss one payment and your 15% interest jumps up to 25% interest. And so one of the things that's really amazing about these organizations is they were really smart and creative in figuring out different ways to take small slices out of every transaction that's going on. Okay. Some people in the finance sector, that is employees, also got big bumps. This is folks, the red line is folks in investment banks. Employees in investment banks. They start out in 1950 getting about 50% more higher salary than the average person in the economy. It's 400% now. The other parts of the financial sector, most of the money gets accrued at the top, not to employees. Right? So this idea of rapid economic growth, right? Of increasing profits year after year is now normative. Right? So we believe, or they believe, or both we and they believe, that banks must be healthy. And what a healthy bank is a bank that's bigger than it was last year. Right? Let's pretend you were in the business of running a household. Right? And every year you had to add a new member to your household. Right? It'd be good for a year or two. Right? But that's okay. Well, the metaphor probably can't go too long. So this is Ted Parmigiani, a research analyst at Lehman Brothers, talking about kind of the urge to cheat. Insider trading would be the kind of cheating you do. You get information about what's going to happen at some company ahead of time. You buy their stock, or you bet against the stock, depending on the kind of information. This is illegal behavior. There's a lot of it went on, and we're beginning to see people prosecuted for this kind of behavior now. Right? So let's take J.P. Morgan Chase. This month has been fined $1 billion for rash behavior in its investment subsidiary in London. It's referred to as the London Whale. This happened 2 years after the crash. They lost $6 billion and have been fined by various parts of the U.S. government, the regulators, $1 billion. So somehow that seems sort of good, right? Okay. Now we know these are bad guys, they break the law, and we're going to go after them. On the other hand, they made that kind of money in a quarter. Right? That is the last quarter we have, they got $6 billion in profits. Right? And that's after they factored in these costs, because they see the costs coming. Right? So part of the story here is this guy's right at the level of the actors, of the workers. Man, it's our job to grow more profits every year. Right? And if we have to cut quarters, we will. Right? We have to sell mortgages to people who can't afford them. If we concentrate mortgages in poor neighborhoods, because that's where where people are the most poorly housed. Right? That's completely legal, by the way. So during the housing boom, people were giving mortgages who had no credit, no jobs, no savings, because they needed those mortgages. Right? But here, it's also just the cost of doing business. It can be factored in ahead of time. And so when you read your Wall Street Journal and it says the banks write off blah, 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 millions of dollars in bad loans or in potential legal costs, they're doing that before they calculate their quarterly profit. Now, JP Morgan, 17% return on equity. Right? That's not so bad. Actually, it's extraordinary. And it's been true year after year. Right? Right now, Bank of America, it's Citicorp. Citicorp is the struggling poor boy of these big banks, and they're only getting 6.5% return on equity every year. Right? The economy is growing at 2%. Right? To give you some sense of reasonable scale. Okay. We are seeing, in the last few years, a rise in legal accusations against these big banks. Green is older. Dark green is older. Light green is more recent. And Citigroup seems to have gotten a buy so far. But we do see this happening. One of the cool things, though, about the JP Morgan news yesterday was for the first time they admitted wrongdoing. In the past, the regulators would give a fine, but not require anyone to explain what had happened. Okay, campaign contributions have been skyrocketing. Okay, so that's a story about the increased power of the banks and about income transfer from the big economy into a very few organizations. But during the same period, some of these same processes are happening on Main Street, that is among non-financial firms. They're making income transfers to the finance sector. They're also responding to this notion that the stock market valuation of the firm, this is the shareholder value movement, is more important than things like market share or production or employment. And this is a fundamental shift. So if it's 1979 and you're the CEO of IBM, you are evaluated on the basis of market share. How big is your company? How many computers can you sell? How many employees do you have? Now, you're evaluated based on return on equity. Right? That is, how much money is available to go back to the stockholders. It's a fundamental shift in thinking about what an economy is for. It's not about production or employment. It's not even about the total value added into the society, but it's a very narrow notion. It's the value created by the organization over the equity that the stockholders have in it. Right? So the range of actors, of people, of human beings that are now supposed to benefit from this economic activity has been substantially narrowed. Right? And there is now a pressure within organizations to find ways to transfer income from that other stuff, employees, production, and whatever, into profits of any sort. One of the ways that this happens is financial investments displace investments in production. I don't know, is this, yeah, we can see this chart. Right? So one of the things we see is that among the largest firms in the economy, financial investments grow tremendously, right? That is proportionally to investments in production. In addition, in a sneaky way, if one wants to change your return on equity, one thing you can do is get rid of your equity, right? And so lots of companies have replaced debt financing with stock financing, right? This means their return on equity goes up. It means the stock value goes up, which is good for the remaining institutional stockholders. It's also really good for the CEOs who have changed their compensation packages to be based on the movement of the stock price. Institutional ownership goes up. I mentioned this before. And companies also change their return on equity by anytime they have a lot of cash, they repurchase their own stock. Apple just announced that they were going to do this with their big stock holdings. Okay, so now I'm going to make this a little bit more clear. So in 2004, GM made $1.3 billion in a quarter, but 66% of it came from its financial arm, GMAC. Ford had a loss from autos, but made over $1 billion from its financial operations. And these are big operations. These are not just financing cars. They're in the business of mortgages, insurance, derivatives. Target, of course, wants to own your debt. Other companies like Sears was a specialist in currency trading, international currency trading. That was one of the, they also wanted to own your debt. Right? So by 2000, about 40% of the earnings among the biggest firms was generated from financial activities. And we can see this from non-financial firms. Financial income over profits rose tremendously. The red line is manufacturing. It's above 60% once you hit the 2005, right before the crash. And this is true for the rest of the economy, but it's these big manufacturing companies in particular. A lot of the action here came out of General Electric. That is a lot of the intellectual work about how to do this. Since the crash, General Electric's GE Capital is now one of the 10 largest banks in the United States. It's now a regulated bank. It's not in that list because I only went out to 6. And GE was really pretty clear about this. So if you think about the 1970s story, GE is a major manufacturing powerhouse coming out of the 70s, now having to face global competition in a lot of ways. And one of the things GE did was specialize in kind of financial transactions. The other thing it did is got rid of lots of its employees. So in just 10 years, they shed half of their employees. Now, this is a more general pattern. Over time, what we see is for the largest firms, their share of revenue in the economy, that's the red line, has gone up. And employment has gone down. And you could see that it's in the 1990s, end of the 1990s, these things diverge, right? So the biggest firms are getting out of production, or if you like, they're specializing in a narrower realm of production, and they're joining the banks at the core. Now, one of the things this means is, like when the bailouts happened in 2008, GM, Chrysler, and GE were among the firms that were bailed out. Okay, so now what does this have to do with inequality? Right? Maybe you can already tell the story here. So first, we are channeling investment money away from production of goods and services, from employment. Right? So when people will complain the United States is no longer a strong manufacturing economy, right? Part of this is by design. That is, the largest firms, the firms that were most equipped to compete globally, made strategic decisions to finance globally. In workplaces, it decouples profits and production. It increases the negotiating power of shareholders and CEOs. And it sets up an internal dynamic that makes labor weaker relative to owners. There's also a big story about CEOs here, but I'm not going to tell too much of it. Maybe someone asks. So other things happen. Productivity gets redefined as something that's in ideas and managers rather than in people. Right? And this is kind of a big cultural shift. It's managers who make productive companies now, not hardworking employees. Now, this is partly a myth, obviously. If you're actually in a workplace, you know it's the people doing the work. But it's a myth that becomes powerful when you worry about things like globalization or tax rates, right? Or how do I make my, who gets paid, right? And then we get this idea of finance as a cultural value, right? Now, obviously, there's a bunch of other things happening at the same time, right? We've got computers that are changing the demand for different types of work. We've got globalization. Right? Now, both of these are really hard on working class Americans in manufacturing. Right? And then we have a bunch of political things that are really important. The most important is the collapse of the union movement. Right? So now there's no countervailing power. Right? So we've got these pressures on firms to move towards return on equity, to replace production-based investment with financial investment, but there's not a political power that's going in the other direction. Some of the strongest deregulation happened under the Clinton administration, for example. The deunionization also does things, makes local labor law more important. In Caroline out here by any chance? Okay, Caroline Hanley's got some very important work that shows that the decline of unionization meant that the rest of the country basically got to have the pay structure of the U.S. South, right? Low pay, no benefits. We got falling minimum wage and changes in tax policy to favor the wealthy. And now I'm almost done here, everybody. You're all being so patient. So we have a number of trends that happen. One, and the most important fundamental, I think, is that the labor share of national income goes down. Right? And so if you think about it, if you think about the economy as that big spaghetti basket of lines I showed you at the beginning of the talk, right? That economy is a bunch of organizations employing a bunch of people, interacting, generating wealth. Right? And then that wealth goes somewhere. Right? So if you think about labor share, the question is, okay, what proportion of the wealth goes to the various employees in all of these organizations, and then what proportion goes to the owners? Right? And so there's been a long-term decline in labor share since 1970. Before that, for 40 years, there was a long-term upswing in labor share. CEO compensation has gone through the roof. This doesn't even have the stock bonuses in it, but just so you can see it going. And then we have earnings inequality among workers. That is, more skilled workers and people in managerial and authority positions, their wages have been going up rapidly, while people at the bottom of the distribution, it's been going down. So for all three of these, we find, this is Ken Howlin and I, we find that when firms have this increase in financial investment, these shifts are exacerbated. Right? This doesn't mean the other things don't matter. Globalization matters. Decline of unionization matters a great deal as well. Here's just the labor share of income. This is a fancier chart than the other ones. Sorry. The blue line is the observed line. That's the same line I showed you before, only it's 1/4 the size. That is, labor share of income is going down. The red line is what would have happened if these non-financial firms had not switched to this financial investment strategy. Labor share would be about 2.5% higher. That's about half of the total change in labor share over time. In terms of magnitude, it's equivalent to the impact of declining unionization. So this financialization change is a really important one to the detriment of labor in the country. It largely goes under the radar. This one's even worse. This is the same kind of exercise, thinking about financialization compared to globalization. It's probably almost a spaghetti for you right now. Remember I showed you that the companies were increasing in debt? That's that blue line across the top. Right? So if companies had not shifted equity to debt in their financing strategy, right, the counterfactual suggests we'd have about 2% higher employment among those companies right now. The line right before it is foreign employment. It's about the same, globalization. Though globalization, you can see, happens later and killing employment among firms, large firms, than the debt ratio. Okay, now I'm going to just sum up. You've been very patient. Okay, so now we've got this new system. Right? It seems natural. right? In some ways, this kind of financial system in all of its systemic risk seems natural is a good thing for us today. If it hadn't, then the pressure on the Tea Party in the Congress yesterday to actually do a deal and raise the debt limit might not have been so high. Right? So a lot of what I almost had two talks for today. One is if the debt limit didn't get raised, and one if it did. That clearly could have created that same systemic tumbling of the world economy that we saw in 2007 and 2008 if the US debt limit hadn't been raised. Or maybe not, but anyway. So now we've got banks that are too big to fail, jail, and too fragile to regulate. Though I think the regulation thing is still out. We are beginning to see the federal regulators fine banks, even make them admit they did things that were illegal. So it's possible. Then we have Main Street, where finance goals are replacing production goals, and together it's a system of income redistribution, right? Into the financial sector, towards capital and CEOs, away from workers. I haven't talked about households and taxes very much, but it's also away from households and the state. So if you think about the beginning of the talk, where we had a housing bubble and a collapse, all those empty houses, terrible recession, right? In some ways, what I'm telling you is that it's worse. Right? So that was an episodic shock to the system. But I'm saying that there's also a kind of fundamental shift in who are the powerful actors and where the money's going. I'm not actually sure if that's worse. You might want to think of this as kind of comparative statics and dynamics. In a fastly moving system, the densely integrated financial core is dangerous. Right? In the slow-moving system that most of us live in, we're a little bit like when they put the frog in the cold water and then turn on the heat and boil it. We don't realize that all the money's gone and our value has gone down as human beings as well. So it's not all bad. The New York Times says American population is not very happy. 80% of Americans think there's going to be another financial crisis, and 92% think that there haven't been enough prosecutions. Right? And then we have immobilized politics about this. Right? On the right, we have the Tea Party movement, who really hate government intervention, and they really don't like the banks, and brought us to an interesting brink last night. And then we have the Occupy Wall Street movement, which in many ways has a much better analysis, but obviously doesn't have 120 members of Congress. On the other hand, at the same time, power is a hard thing to disrupt. Right? And that network of financial entanglements is also a network of power. Right? And the people who are in that network think it's natural and normal just like us. They're not really bad people. Or if they are, it's not in that dimension necessarily. That is, they think they've earned what they've got. Right? So there was a lot of people upset about the bank bailouts. Charles Munger, Berkshire Hathaway, hedge fund made possible by the Black-Scholes-Merton formula. His reaction about the 99% is they're a bunch of whiners. Suck it in and cope, buddy. Or Steven Schwarzman, worth $7.7 billion. That's even more than JP Morgan earns in a quarter. Another hedge fund. This is about changing the tax rules so he can't bring his $7 billion home. Right, so right now, investments are taxed at 15%. The dean's marginal tax rate is probably 35%. And the whole idea that his tax rate should be raised. He thinks it's like Hitler invading Poland. The last quote, and then I'm going to end, is even worse. This is the Benmosche, who's now the CEO of AIG, which was the firm that insured all of these big banks and failed. He's actually sort of a duffer, only $13 million compensation. And he thinks being outraged over these financial institutions is something like a kind of racial terror in the South in the mid-last century. All right. Thanks very much for your patience. Oh, and for my class, I'll put it up tonight too.
And the solution?
Well, if we go back to, you know, okay, there's a lot of answers to this. This question, and if we go back to the 1930s, after the 1929 crash, the federal government basically didn't do very much for about 4 years until there was a second recession, right? And people got out in the street. Right? So two things happened there. There was on the market side a lesson, oh, this is not an aberration, right? And then there was political pressure. So in some ways, Occupy Wall Street is the solution. Maybe the Tea Party is too. And in my dark moments last weekend, I was thinking, okay, if the debt limit doesn't go up, and we have a replay of 2008, though it could be even worse, which I don't know that I have the stomach for. Maybe you get something, right? I think another part of the solution, though, is you have to discredit the idea that current economic arrangements are natural and normal. Right? And so I briefly sort of alluded to this idea of neoliberalism. And one of the things that's happened in our society, it's happened around the world, but in our society it's been really very strongly institutionalized, is this notion that income distributions are the natural and normal product of markets. But that's not true. They are the natural and normal products of institutions and the politics that create institutions, some of which might be market-like. And so I think it's also partly, it's one of the reasons why I have this slide and stress the kind of ideological role of economic thinking, which is the neoclassical move in the economics profession helped naturalize this notion that competitive markets were the solution to all problems. Even though many markets that are not regulated are also not competitive. And that would be the case here. What did you think of that answer? A little bit of a dodge?
Yeah, a little bit of a dodge.
Yeah. It's so much easier to read history backwards.
Yeah.
You know?
But given the cycles, it's going to happen again.
Yeah, I think that's right. Nancy?
If we were going to turn this into like a brainstorming session, I'll throw out something that I think is pretty specific. I think there's a lot of concern that banks that are too big to fail are too big to exist, and that there ought to be a really serious effort to make the banking sector in the US more competitive and less characterized by oligopoly power. And one vehicle for doing that could be to really expand the role of credit unions, to remove some of the restrictions that are currently operating on some fairly decentralized, very effective little local financial institutions that are very deeply embedded in their local communities and connected potentially to local businesses. So I think that's an example of a pretty specific remedy that should go on the table.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. And it's partly when I say that it's not that we have to not think about the current distribution as natural and normal and justified by some abstract market. Instead, what we have to ask questions about are, what are the specific institutional mechanisms by which we get things done? right? And a credit union's a totally different approach. In some ways, if you think about that Glass-Steagall dismantling deregulation story, it was a movement from local banking to global banking, from small, constrained, you're not allowed to get too big and too dangerous systems, to if you swallow the world, that's okay. Right? And one of the biggest things that came out of the recent crash was all of these big banks got bigger. And so when I did that original kind of network diagram, those were all banks. And about a third of them now have been eaten by the other banks. But I think Nancy's absolutely right. Now, how do you get to that point? So you could have a mass movement at the level of individuals, move your money into credit unions, or move your money into local banks. I'd say when I moved here, we put all our money in a local bank, which was then bought by a Vermont bank, which was then bought by a Boston bank. It hasn't been bought by one of the top 10 yet, but it wasn't what we had in mind. So maybe if we'd done it in a credit union. Right. So there's a mass movement version of this, right? But then there's also got to be a political version of this. And so there are things like Tobin taxes, the idea that you tax transactions to slow down the speed of the economy. And the Tea Party people totally want to find some way that you don't have automatic bailouts of big banks. But part of it is, let's go back here. Kristen's going to love this. Kristen, I'm going to end up here. Come on. This was so long. How did you all stand it? There it is. So part of the problem is once you create a system of exchange that's also a system of power, it's how do you take a particular piece out, right? And it's partly, if you get a picture like this, it's a static piece. So if, in fact, we had a kind of a strong mobilization to change the institutional rules, either at the state level or the federal level, to favor credit unions, you can imagine there's going to be a mobilization of those banks at the core, right? So the institutions require the politics, I think.
Yeah, and maybe they require the police. So, I mean, I don't have an economic bone in my body. I don't know any of this stuff. But I think the most disheartening thing that happened in the last few years was the brutal way that they broke up Occupy. To have, stormtroopers come out and do that kind of stuff, where does one go from there?
I think mass politics work like that. In the early rounds of mass politics, there's brutal repression.
Yeah. So we thought,
and you have to, and then the question really is how do you keep people mobilized under that threat?
I mean, people still get really upset about whatever the railroad thing in 1900 where they shot on people.
Right.
But nobody gets upset about shooting on Wall Street Park.
Right.
I mean, there's just nobody getting mad about it.
Yeah.
Anyway, seems very discouraging.
That's even more discouraging than I was, but yes.
Given the state of the game as you see it, what would your advice be to the undergraduates who are here now for how they should partake in this system? Should they occupy Wall Street? Should they join the Tea Party? Should they join a bank? What would you advise?
I think the bank route, you'll no longer be treated as if you're the smartest guy at the cocktail party. People are going to look at you a little sideways. So I think you should take Nancy's version of this. That is, if you want to be a financial intermediary, you should go work for a credit union. Yeah, well, I think that's right. That students are. I don't mean to reduce the tuition bill here on campus, but students are the lifeblood of mass political movements in modern societies. So I think that's important. I think there are also political candidates that matter. I mean, Elizabeth Warren getting elected was really amazing and a good thing. The Tea Party people backing down last night was a pretty important thing. We're beginning, however, to get a mobilization out of Wall Street against the Tea Party movement. Right? And it's partly over the last 10 years, a lot of American corporations and their peak organizations put a lot of money into redistricting because they like the idea of having a Republican House. But now they don't have control. So I don't think you should go for the Tea Party unless it was like when I was young. If you'd go to a demonstration in New York in the 1970s, there'd always be a communist agitator on the sideline trying to get people to start throwing rocks. And it wasn't me, and nor was it my wife back here, but she was at the demonstration. It could have been her. But you could play that role for the Tea Party, right? I don't know, probably backfire. Yeah. Sanjeev.
One version of your story is, well, the one you told.
Do you have another version in mind?
So, the Great Depression was a bigger crash than the Great Recession, and was preceded by a similar sort of concentration of big firms, but they weren't financial firms, or at least to the degree they are now. So the other version of your story is that it's concentration and what Nancy would call oligarchies, that's a problem. Not necessarily that they are financial institutions. So how much of your story is about finance per se, and and that sort of matters to what sort of any solution is going to look like.
Right, that's a great question. So, is this about finance per se, or any kind of concentration of economic power, right? And so in kind of the standard economic model, concentration, oligopoly, the reduction of competition increases price-setting autonomy, money flows to those organizations or that organization if it's a monopoly, right? But there's always inherent limit on demand for a particular product. But finance serves as an intermediary for all transactions, and that has only deepened over time, right? So at the time of the Great Depression, there were no credit cards. We also did not have automated day trading. We did not have electronic-based financial intermediation between countries, nor did we have speculation in derivatives, currency, and the like. So finance right now is both more integrated into all of our everyday lives than aluminum, though that's very important for your soda and your beer cans. And it has this kind of speculative character built on top of it, right? So if you think about plain old concentration, this is my ability to take money from you, right? But now we have systems that allow me to take money from you and also bet against myself in case I fail. So it's a system that moves very rapidly. So stock in the late 70s, early 80s, the average share of stock would turn over every 7 years. Now it's less than a year. So that's the kind of pressure. Well, that tells you something about the fee-generating business of investment banks, right? But it also tells you something about the kind of short-term financial pressure that's on the rest of the economy, right? The same thing happens to you when you miss a payment on your credit card. Barbara.
But just also, one of the big differences between what we think of as monopolies among production companies versus financial companies is that in production companies, they hire workers who then can be a countervailing, force because they're important to the whole system. But in the financial sector, you know, they're sort of replaceable and don't need any training and whatever, and there are fewer and fewer of them. And it's the people at the top and in the management positions that where all the value is seen as accruing. So it also means lower employment, right?
It could. I don't actually. So during this period where we've got this rise in value moving through the finance sector and profitability, employment does grow in that sector, but not at the same rate. So it's not totally decoupled. And in investment firms, it's not decoupled at all. Investment firms actually reward, pay their employees based on profit generation. So there are some jobs there. Obviously, the New York City jobs and the people who live in southern Connecticut and Westchester County, New York, totally depend on those jobs. And so does the New York City economy. And the Charlotte economy. But, yeah. No tomatoes to be thrown? Sanjeev is back.
Yeah, and this is the tomato. One of the, I think, things that the left misses in the critique of big banks, and what Nancy said, I think, is an example of this, is that this is the sort of too big to fail. Well, the opposite of that might be too small to succeed. It's the big banks that, if you want to do something big, like stop, sort of make solar panels affordable to everyone. I can guarantee you it's not going to be your local credit union that can accomplish that. It is going to be, city. Because A, they have the capital, and maybe more crucially, they figured out how to move huge amounts of capital in less than a day. Now, what we saw was the detrimental sort of side of that. But to me, it suggests that really the problem here is the ownership of the banks, not the fact that they are big. So if you had a state bank that was that big, right, the way some of the European countries have it, and then the other distortions. But if you had a state-run credit union, which some states are now getting into that game, and you made the decisions based on criteria other than your CEO's bonuses, then those large sums of money, you could wipe out poverty in most American cities overnight, and your local credit union can't do it. It's got to be, people who can spend huge amounts of money and who can account for it down to the cent. And that's the big guys. They know how to do it.
Yeah, I think that's totally reasonable. In fact, I wish I'd ended the talk that way. That is, there are some kinds of large-scale projects that we can imagine that require this. Now, the current institutional configuration is one where you have very large organizations with very weak controls and lots of incentives in the system that allows them to be both speculative and to continue growing. And reward systems that are tied to return on equity and being the smartest person in the room, where being the smartest person in the room is about being the richest person in the room, right? So if one changed the reward structures to reflect what are the social goods that are being produced here, that would be nice. And that takes a larger bit of imagination. So when I was beginning to think about the world in a kind of political economy, sophisticated way, I don't know if it was sophisticated, however it was, we were all mad at large corporations because they had too much power and they were oligopolies, right? And GM was ripping us off. But boy, they employed a lot of people at good wages with benefits, right? So in some ways, I mean, this is the limit of my imagination. I sort of think back to the good old days of monopoly capitalism. But what probably we need to be doing is thinking the way you and Nancy are. What are the new institutional arrangements that we want to have our politics aimed at? So last night our politics were aimed at preventing a crisis. That's probably not good enough. Yeah. Well, thank you all very much.
Thanks very much, Don. Those, yeah, leave that. It's very attractive. We have some food here, a little reception. You're welcome to ask Don more questions and talk to the Coles and thank them for making this possible, and congratulate Kyle again for his award. So thank you all for coming.